My name is Elise Hart, and I was 22 when I stood on a graduation stage in front of a packed stadium, watching my parents sit in the front row like they belonged there, dressed for my twin sister's moment, completely unaware I was about to be called to the microphone as the top graduate. If you're listening right now, tell me where you are and what time it is there. I like knowing I'm not talking into the void. 2 weeks before that day, if you'd asked my parents anything about me, they would have smiled politely and changed the subject, because to them I was never the one worth mentioning, never the one worth investing in, never the one they planned a future around, and they would have said it the same way people talk about bad stock, not with anger, just with certainty. But the story doesn't begin with the cap and gown or the bright sunlight on the field. It starts 4 years earlier in our living room, when two college acceptance letters arrived on the same Tuesday in April, and my parents treated them like proof that they'd been right about us all along. My sister, Sienna, got into a private university called Briarcrest. Beautiful campus, glossy brochures, a tuition number that made my stomach tighten even before anyone spoke. I got into Lakeview State, a public school with a respectable program and a price tag that was still heavy but not insane, the kind of place you can make work if you're willing to live small and stay focused. That night, my father called us into the living room like it was a board meeting, sitting in his favorite chair with his hands folded like he was about to announce an acquisition, while my mother settled on the couch with her posture straight and her eyes carefully neutral, the way she looked whenever she didn't want to be blamed for what was coming. Sienna stood near the window already glowing, not from arrogance exactly, just from knowing the room had always tilted toward her, and I sat across from my father with my acceptance letter still in my hand, because a part of me, quiet and stubborn, still believed the word family meant something when it mattered. He started with her, of course, telling Sienna they would cover everything at Briarcrest: tuition, housing, the meal plan, whatever special extras the school could package as experience, and she squealed and grabbed my mother's hands, and my mother smiled like she was watching the outcome she'd prayed for. Then my father turned his head to me with the same calm expression and said they had decided they wouldn't be paying for my education. At first, I honestly thought I'd misheard him, because the sentence didn't fit the room, didn't fit the story families usually tell about themselves. So I asked him to repeat it, and he did, slowly, as if he was explaining something simple to someone slow. He said Sienna had potential, that she was good socially, that she made a strong impression, that she would build connections, and that paying for her education made sense because it was an investment. Then he looked at me with a small shrug and said, I was smart, but not remarkable, and there was no real return in putting money into me. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. It was clinical, like my value had already been calculated and filed away. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to react, waiting for her to say something like, "That's enough." But she didn't meet my eyes, not even once. And I looked at my sister and she was already tapping on her phone, probably telling someone about Briarcrest, because the conversation had ended the moment she got what she came for. My father leaned back and told me I'd figure it out, because I was resourceful, and I nodded because there was nothing else to do in that moment without breaking apart in front of them. I went to my room that night and I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because I'd spent too many years crying over smaller versions of the same message, hand-me-downs given to me like charity, birthdays half-remembered, family pictures where Sienna stood in the center and I was pushed toward the edge like a mistake they couldn't crop cleanly. I sat on my bed with my phone face down and my acceptance letter open on my lap, and something inside me went quiet in a way I'd never felt before, like a door closing without a slam. My father had made it clear. In their minds, I wasn't their daughter in the way that mattered. I was the option you don't choose, the one you don't put money behind, the one you let fade out. And while they slept comfortably in the certainty of that decision, I opened my old laptop, the one I'd been given after Sienna upgraded. The one with the cracked corner and the battery that died if you looked at it wrong. And I searched for scholarships for students who didn't have family support, not as a dramatic act, not as some grand revenge plan, but because I could feel the future tightening like a rope. And I knew if I didn't take my own hands and pull myself free, I would spend the rest of my life living inside the story they'd written for me. I grew up in a house that looked normal to outsiders, the kind of place where neighbors waved and my mother sent polite holiday cards. But inside, it ran on an invisible hierarchy everyone pretended didn't exist, and I learned early that my role wasn't to be celebrated. It was to be useful. Sienna and I were twins, close in age but not in treatment, and the differences were never explained because explanations would have required honesty. So instead, I absorbed it through repetition. She was the one they displayed, and I was the one they leaned on. When we were little, it showed up in small choices. Her dance lessons kept going even when money was tight, while my activities were always the first to be trimmed, framed as practical decisions that somehow only applied to me. If there was a school event, my father remembered hers without being reminded, and if there was a schedule conflict, mine was the one that could be skipped because I was understanding. That word followed me through childhood like a leash, because being understanding meant not asking for too much, not needing too much, not taking up the kind of space that would force them to look at what they were doing. By middle school, I was the quiet organizer in the background, the one who packed lunches when my mother was late, the one who reminded my father about permission slips, the one who knew where the spare keys were and which bills were overdue. Not because anyone taught me responsibility as some noble value, but because someone had to carry the little things that kept the household moving, and they decided it would be me. When Sienna forgot something, it was brushed off as her being busy or stressed or such a social butterfly, and when I forgot something, it was treated like a character flaw, a disappointment, proof that I couldn't be trusted. That kind of imbalance trains you in a specific type of discipline, the kind that isn't praised because it's expected, and the kind that becomes addictive because it's the only way to earn a small moment of peace. I did well in school, not because I was naturally obsessed with grades, but because achievement was the only currency in our house that could briefly buy me a softer tone of voice from my father, a glance of approval from my mother, a break from being spoken about like a problem. I learned to anticipate moods the way some people learn weather patterns, because it was safer to prevent storms than to survive them. So I became good at reading my mother's silence and my father's impatience, good at timing requests, good at making myself low maintenance so nobody could accuse me of being difficult. And the strange thing is, from the outside, it looked like I was the easy child, the mature one, the independent one, the one who didn't need much, and that label became a convenient excuse for them to give me less. When relatives visited, I was the polite one who offered drinks, who cleared plates, who answered questions, while Sienna performed in the living room with her stories and her laugh, and my parents watched her with that soft pride people usually reserve for something they think represents them well. I never hated her for it as a kid, because children don't always name unfairness as cruelty, they just adapt. And I adapted by becoming the person who made things easier for everyone else. Even the way my father spoke about our future was divided. He talked about Sienna like she was a project with potential returns, networking, leadership, the kind of girl who could walk into a room and come out with opportunities, while he talked about me like I was a stable background asset, useful but not exciting, smart but not magnetic, someone who would do fine without needing extra support. My mother didn't correct him, not because she didn't notice, but because she believed peace came from avoiding conflict, and avoiding conflict meant letting his opinions become policy. There were moments that could have changed things, moments where she could have chosen me openly, but she always made the safer choice, the smoother choice, the choice that kept the family image intact, And over time, I stopped expecting her to do anything else. By high school, I had a part-time job, not because I wanted spending money, but because it was the only way to stop asking for things that would be held against me later, and I learned the quiet satisfaction of paying for my own necessities, my own toiletries, my own bus pass, my own cheap clothes, because it meant fewer conversations where I was reminded, directly or indirectly, that I cost something. That self-sufficiency wasn't celebrated. It was absorbed into the family narrative as proof they were right about me not needing them. And every time I proved I could handle something alone, it became another reason they felt justified in leaving me alone. When the college letters arrived, that foundation was already built. Years of being the one who carried the unglamorous parts of life. Years of being reliable without reward. Years of watching Sienna receive support as if it were natural, and watching my own needs be treated as optional. So when my father sat in that chair and told me he wouldn't pay for my education, it didn't come out of nowhere. It landed on a structure that had been quietly assembled over 18 years, and I understood immediately that this wasn't just a financial decision. It was the final confirmation of a role I'd been living in for so long that everyone else assumed it was my personality. And that was the part they never considered. The person who carries everything eventually learns exactly what happens when she stops. The pattern was never a single dramatic act. It was the constant, casual way my effort got translated into entitlement. Like the more I gave, the more they felt it was owed. If Sienna needed something, it became a family priority. And if I needed something, it became a conversation about budgets and practicality and how I should understand. When we were 16, my father brought home a new car for her, shiny and clean, with a bow stretched across the hood, and everyone laughed and took pictures and called her lucky, while I was handed her old electronics like leftovers, a worn laptop that shut down without warning, a phone that lagged when I typed, and my mother said softly that we couldn't afford to do the same for both of us, as if the only two choices were a brand new car or nothing at all. The thing is, it wasn't that money didn't exist, it was that money only existed for what they valued. And they valued her. Ski trips, summer programs, a prom dress that cost more than my entire back-to-school wardrobe, a graduation gift trip before college that was treated like a rite of passage. I watched all of it from the edge of the room, not because they told me to stand there, but because they arranged life, so I naturally ended up there, always one step away from the center. Family vacations were where it became impossible to pretend. Sienna got her own hotel room because she needed space, and I slept on pull-out couches or in makeshift beds, once even in what the resort called a cozy nook, that was really a converted storage closet with a thin door, and when I laughed awkwardly about it, my father said it built character. Like discomfort was a lesson specifically meant for me. In photos, she was always positioned in the middle, the best light, the best angle, her smile framed like an advertisement, and I was placed at the end, sometimes half cut off, sometimes asked to take the picture instead. And if I ever pointed it out, my mother insisted I was imagining things, because the only way she could keep living with it was to deny it out loud. I learned to stop asking questions that made people uncomfortable, which is another way of saying I learned to swallow my own reality for the sake of theirs. And then there were the moments that weren't meant for me to see. The ones that slip through because people get careless when they assume you don't matter enough to be hurt. A few months before the college decision, I walked into the kitchen and saw my mother's phone unlocked on the counter, a text thread open with my aunt, and I shouldn't have read it, but my eyes did what eyes do when they land on your own name. My mother had written that she felt bad for me, but my father was right, that I didn't stand out, that they had to be practical. Practical. Like choosing between two appliances. Like loving one child less was a budgeting strategy. I set the phone back down and walked away so quietly I surprised myself, because the anger didn't come first. The numbness did. And numbness is dangerous because it doesn't demand anything, it just records. That night, I sat in my room, and the college conversation replayed in my head with new clarity, not as a one-time cruelty, but as the natural result of every small choice they'd made for years. And I realized something that felt almost embarrassing in how obvious it was. My sacrifice had never earned me respect because my sacrifice was the system. They didn't see my effort as something to appreciate. They saw it as the default setting of my existence. And the moment I stopped providing, the moment I stopped being convenient, they would call it selfishness. That was the trap. They didn't have to ask me to carry things because I had already been trained to pick them up before they hit the floor. I paid for my own small needs so I wouldn't have to beg. I took on extra chores so no one could accuse me of being ungrateful. I kept my grades high so they couldn't justify treating me like dead weight. And every time I did those things, they relaxed further into the belief that I'd always do them. It was quiet exploitation dressed up as family dynamics, and the hardest part was how normal it felt while I was inside it. But after I read that text, the fog thinned, and I started noticing the pattern everywhere. The way my father spoke to me only when he needed something done. The way my mother offered affection mostly as a cover after a slight. The way Sienna's life was narrated as a series of opportunities, and mine as a series of "you'll manage." I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a turning point. I just began to watch them like an outsider would, collecting evidence. And the more I watched, the clearer it became that I wasn't being treated unfairly by accident. I was being used on purpose, not maliciously, not with villainous laughter, but with the calm confidence of people who assume you'll never leave your assigned position. That's when awareness arrived. Not as an explosion, but as a slow, steady tightening inside my chest, the kind that tells you the truth has finally landed and it isn't going anywhere. After that night, I didn't become louder, I became quieter. But it wasn't the quiet of defeat. It was the quiet of someone closing accounts and canceling subscriptions, the quiet of withdrawing from a system that had been overdrawing me for years. I stopped trying to get them to notice the imbalance, because I finally understood that noticing would cost them something they didn't want to pay: guilt, accountability, a change in the way they saw themselves, and people protect their self-image the way they protect money. So I didn't plead for fairness and I didn't ask for explanations. I just moved my expectations out of their hands and into my own, one small decision at a time. The first thing I did was open my laptop and search for scholarships for students with no family support, not as a dramatic announcement, just as a private act of survival, because if they decided I was not worth the investment, then I had to become the investor, the manager, the entire board of directors of my own life. I sat on my bedroom floor with a notebook and a cheap calculator, doing the numbers until my eyes burned. Tuition, housing, fees, books, food. The kind of invisible costs people forget when they've never had to count them. Lakeview State was cheaper than Briarcrest, but cheaper doesn't mean easy when the number is still bigger than anything you've ever had. I wrote down what I had saved from summer jobs, and it was so small compared to the total that for a moment I just stared at it like it belonged to someone else. The gap wasn't intimidating, it was violent in its scale, and the old version of me would have panicked and tried to negotiate with my father, would have begged my mother in the kitchen when she was alone, would have promised to do anything, to work, to pay it back, to prove I deserved help. Instead, I felt something colder settle in. I wasn't going to audition for a place in my own family anymore. I started listing options the way you do when you're cornered and you need to see exits. Massive loans that would follow me for decades. Part-time school stretched out into a slow crawl while I worked full-time, dropping out before I even started and letting their story about me become fact. Every option ended with the same humiliation: becoming the twin who didn't make it, the one people talked about in lowered voices at holidays, the one my father could reference as proof he'd been right. And that's when the internal shift sharpened into a single clean thought. I would rather be exhausted than trapped. I would rather suffer privately than beg publicly. I would rather build a life that was mine than live inside theirs, hoping they'd finally approve the blueprint. I scrolled through scholarship databases for hours, filtering scams from real opportunities, reading requirements that felt designed to weed out people like me, recommendations, essays, volunteer experience, leadership, proof of need, proof of excellence, proof of worthiness, as if worthiness is something you can photocopy and attach. Most of them were small amounts, symbolic help that wouldn't touch the real cost, and then I found a merit program tied to Lakeview State that covered full tuition for a handful of independent students each year. With a small living stipend, and it felt like spotting a door in a wall you'd assumed was solid. It wasn't guaranteed. The competition would be brutal, but it was real. And real was enough to make me keep going. I bookmarked everything, built a spreadsheet, wrote deadlines in my notebook, and then I found a national scholarship with a name that sounded like legacy and power, the kind of foundation people whisper about in guidance counselor offices. A full ride with living support, limited winners, the kind of award that doesn't just pay bills, it changes the way institutions look at you. I remember laughing once, not because it was funny, but because the idea of someone like me being chosen felt absurd, in the way a fantasy feels absurd right before you decide to treat it like a plan. I bookmarked it anyway. Then I started designing a schedule the way you design an escape route: multiple jobs, stacked hours, no wasted motion. I wrote down what I could realistically earn before classes started, what I could earn during semesters, what I could earn on weekends. I researched the cheapest housing I could find within walking distance, because I knew if I added a car payment or parking or gas, it would break the whole structure. And I found a tiny room in a shared house with too many people and not enough privacy, the kind of place you don't show off on social media, the kind of place you endure because it keeps you moving. I mapped out a routine that looked impossible on paper. Early shifts, full course load, late nights studying, small hours of sleep, rinse, repeat, for years. It wasn't inspirational, it was arithmetic. If I wanted freedom, this was the cost. And the strangest part was how calm I felt while I planned it. Like once I stopped hoping they would save me, my mind finally had room to work. In the week before I left for school, Sienna posted photos from a beach trip with friends, sunset drinks, matching swimsuits, laughing in golden light. And my mother commented hearts under every picture, proud like she'd funded the whole joy, while I packed a thrift store comforter into a secondhand suitcase and checked my account balance twice, because numbers don't lie, and I couldn't afford to be sentimental. Our lives were separating in real time, and no one called it tragedy because she was still smiling, and families often confuse one person's comfort for the health of the whole system. The night before I left, my father stood in the doorway of my room and told me he expected me to handle things, said it like a compliment, and I looked at him and nodded because I understood what he meant. Don't embarrass us. Don't ask for help. Don't make your struggle visible. I didn't correct him. I didn't argue. I just let his words slide off me like rain on glass, because somewhere between that living room meeting and this suitcase on my bed, I had already stopped seeing him as someone who decided my worth. When I arrived at Lakeview State, the work started immediately, and my emotional withdrawal deepened into something practical. I stopped calling home unless I had to, and when I did, I kept my voice neutral and my answers short. I didn't tell them about the jobs I was lining up, the way I was counting every grocery item, the way I borrowed textbooks instead of buying them, because sharing those details would have been another form of begging, Another invitation for them to offer shallow sympathy without changing anything. I watched other students move through campus like time was something they owned. Football games, late-night pizza runs, weekend trips, while I moved like time was something I rented by the hour. I took early shifts at a campus cafe where the smell of burned coffee clung to my clothes. I cleaned where I could for extra money. I hunted for any paid role that didn't collide with my class schedule, and I started living on a rhythm that made my body feel older than it should have been. At night, before sleep, I began whispering the same sentence to myself, not like a mantra for motivation, more like a reminder of a contract I'd signed. This is the price of freedom. Freedom from needing their approval, freedom from being measured against my sister, freedom from that constant ache of trying to earn love that should have been automatic. I wasn't angry anymore in the hot, loud way anger is portrayed. What I felt was cleaner and sharper, like a blade being honed, and the blade wasn't for anyone else. It was for cutting ties inside my own mind. I didn't confront them because confrontation would have kept them central, and I was already shifting my center away from them, inch by inch, day by day, until the distance stopped hurting and started feeling like space I could breathe in. The point of no return wasn't a screaming match or a dramatic exit. It was a single moment where the last thread of respect I still held for them snapped without noise. It happened freshman year, on Thanksgiving, when I stayed near campus because going home wasn't realistic for me, and even if it had been, I didn't want to step back into that house and pretend the living room decision never happened. I spent that morning in my tiny rented room, the kind of place where the heater clicked like it was tired too, and I called home anyway because a part of me still moved on old instincts, still reaching for proof that I mattered, still hoping the holiday would soften them. My mother answered, distracted, the warm sounds of a full house behind her, laughter, clinking dishes, the low hum of a gathering I wasn't part of. And she said Happy Thanksgiving like it was something she could offer me over the phone without noticing the loneliness on my end. I asked if my father was there, if I could talk to him. And there was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional. And then I heard his voice in the background, muffled but clear, saying, "Tell her I'm busy." My mother came back onto the line with that artificial brightness people use when they're trying to smooth over something sharp, saying he was in the middle of something, saying Sienna was telling a funny story, asking me if I was eating enough, if I needed anything, as if my needs were limited to food and not the basic human thing I'd been starving for my entire life. I looked at the instant noodles on my desk, the borrowed textbooks stacked beside them, the thin blanket I'd bought secondhand, and I told her, calmly, that I didn't need anything, because I was done offering them opportunities to disappoint me. We said, I love you in the way people say it when they think the words erase the choices, and I hung up with a steady hand, then opened my phone and scrolled because I knew I'd find what I always found: evidence. The first thing I saw was a photo Sienna had posted. My mother and father at the dining table beside her, candles lit, turkey shining, everyone looking comfortable and full and proud. And the caption was about being thankful for her amazing family. I didn't zoom in to torture myself. I zoomed in because my brain has always chased details, and there it was, plain and undeniable. 3 place settings, 3 chairs, 3 people centered in the frame like a complete unit. With no extra seat, no empty plate, nothing that suggested I existed even as an absence. They hadn't set a place for me, not even as a gesture, not even as a polite lie they could tell themselves later. I sat there for a long time staring at that image until the ache I'd carried for years shifted into something hollow and quiet. And that quiet was the real break. Because pain can keep you attached, but emptiness is clean. In that moment, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost gentle. I wasn't being left out by accident. I was being excluded as a preference. And if that was true, then there was no version of me, no perfect GPA, no relentless work ethic, no self-sacrifice that could earn my way into their hearts the way I once believed. That photo did what their words never fully managed to do. It made the situation undeniable without needing interpretation, and when something becomes undeniable, you stop negotiating with it. I closed the app, set my phone face down, and made one decision, quiet enough that no one could argue with it. I would stop trying to be chosen by people who were comfortable living as if I wasn't there. After that, the funny part was how easy it was for them to keep believing they'd won, because winning, to people like my parents, meant the world staying exactly the way they arranged it. They didn't need to check on me to feel secure. My absence made their life simpler, and simplicity looks like success when you're the one benefiting. My mother called occasionally with the same soft, distracted tone, asking surface questions that required nothing from her. How are classes? Are you eating? Is the weather cold there? Then rushing off because Sienna needed something or my father was busy or there were errands, and each call ended with the same line, "We love you," like a stamp they could press onto the conversation before filing it away. My father didn't call at all, not once. In his mind, I'd accepted the deal, and acceptance meant consent. The longer he didn't hear complaints, the more he convinced himself the decision was fine, maybe even good for me, like hardship was a training program he'd enrolled me in without my permission. Sienna texted a few times, mostly updates about her life, photos of her dorm, parties, Briarcrest events, captions about how stressful finals were while she posted from a cafe with fancy lattes, and I read them without reacting the way I used to, because I'd stopped translating her attention into proof of closeness. She never asked how I was surviving. Not really. Not in the concrete sense of, "Are you okay? Do you have enough? How are you managing rent?" Because asking would have forced her to acknowledge the gap between us, and she didn't want to look at that gap any more than my mother did. They all moved through their lives like my struggle was a background fact, like the twin who handled it was simply doing what she always did, which was carry her own weight quietly, so nobody else had to adjust. Meanwhile, I was living on a schedule that left no room for softness. Early shifts at the campus cafe, classes stacked to avoid extra semesters, late nights in the library until the security guard started turning lights off, section by section, and I became a person who measured life in practical units. Hours, paychecks, deadlines, syllabi, application windows. I kept my grades perfect not because I enjoyed the pressure, but because excellence was the only leverage I had, and I needed leverage if I wanted scholarships, if I wanted doors to open without my father's money. I learned which days the dining hall offered the cheapest meal swipes, which professors were more flexible about office hours, which student jobs paid a little more, which campus buildings stayed open late, and those details became my version of comfort. In the middle of that, my parents looked outward and celebrated Sienna like she was the only story worth telling. They booked her flights home for breaks without hesitation, paid for her sorority events, laughed about her networking dinners, posted her photos on social media with captions about how proud they were, and their friends commented hearts and congratulations as if my parents were generous, successful, loving, as if the image was proof. At home, they planned holidays around her schedule, adjusted dinner times for her, bought her little extras because she was under so much pressure, and every time they did it, they reinforced the same belief. Their investment was paying off, their choice was justified, their family was functioning exactly as intended. Even when my mother occasionally sounded slightly uneasy on the phone, asking if I was lonely, if I missed home, I could hear the part of her that wanted reassurance more than truth, and I didn't give it to her. I kept my answers neutral, calm, and simple, because I wasn't going to comfort her into thinking neglect was harmless. And because I didn't argue, because I didn't demand, because I didn't crash into their lives with my pain. They mistook my silence for acceptance, maybe even gratitude, the way people do when they're used to taking without consequence. Sienna posted pictures from warm beaches during spring break while I stayed on campus picking up extra shifts. My father sent her money for emergencies, while I calculated whether I could afford laundry that week. When Briarcrest raised tuition, he complained but paid it anyway, like it was the cost of doing business, while I watched classmates swipe their cards at the bookstore, and I borrowed older editions of textbooks from the library because new ones were out of reach. And through all of it, my parents kept moving like the story was finished. Sienna was the success. I was the independent one, the one who didn't need help, the one who would turn out fine. And in their minds, that was victory. They didn't know that while they were celebrating the outcome they expected, I was quietly building something they couldn't see, something that didn't require their permission, something that would eventually stand in front of them in a stadium full of people and make them realize that winning isn't real when you've been applauding the wrong person the entire time. The revenge, if you can even call it that, was that I stopped giving them access to my life, and I did it without speeches, without ultimatums, without a single dramatic announcement, because the most powerful thing I could take from them was the illusion that they still had a right to claim me. Sometime after that Thanksgiving, during my second semester, I took a class that changed the trajectory of everything, an economics course taught by Dr. Celeste Harding, a professor with a reputation for being impossible to impress. And I sat in the third row, did the work, turned in my first paper expecting to be average, and got it back with a grade that felt unreal and a note telling me to see her after class. I assumed I'd made some mistake, but when I sat down in her office, she studied me for a long moment and said, my writing was the kind she usually only saw from students who'd been trained, mentored, supported, and when I told her I hadn't been, that I was paying my way alone, something in her expression sharpened into focus, the way a person looks when they finally understand what they're looking at. I didn't tell her everything because I wanted sympathy. I told her because she asked plain questions and didn't flinch at the answers, and when I finished she said there was a National Foundation scholarship I should apply for. Full ride, living support, the kind of award that doesn't just pay for school, it changes your orbit. And she said it mattered because winners at partner universities are often asked to speak at commencement. I remember the way she said it, calmly, like she was offering a fact and not a fantasy. And when I hesitated, she told me something that stayed with me. Potential means nothing if no one sees it, so let me help you be seen. The next 2 years became a disciplined blur. Early shifts, classes, library, sleep that never felt like enough. A perfection I maintained not because I wanted to be admired, but because I needed an exit. And when Dr. Harding told me she was officially nominating me for that scholarship, I didn't celebrate out loud. I just nodded and went back to work, like the world might collapse if I relaxed. The application was brutal. Essays, interviews, recommendations, background checks, the kind of process designed to test how badly you want to stay standing. And in the middle of it, my sister sent a casual message about how it was sad I didn't come home for holidays. And I read it once, put the phone down, and kept typing, because I wasn't going to explain my absence to someone who never noticed my struggle. When I was selected as a finalist, the final interview was in a city hundreds of miles away, and I did the math with the same cold precision I'd used since that living room meeting. Transportation, food, rent due soon. And I almost closed the laptop because I didn't have the margin to chase miracles. A friend from campus, Mara, saw my face, asked what happened, and when I showed her the email, she reacted like it was already done, like the only acceptable outcome was me going, and she pushed money into my hands before I could refuse. Not as charity, but as a matter-of-fact investment in something she could see, even when my parents couldn't. I took the cheapest option, an overnight bus. Arrived stiff and underdressed compared to everyone else in that waiting room, surrounded by polished candidates with parents hovering nearby, and I sat there in my borrowed blazer reminding myself I didn't need to belong, I just needed to be undeniable. 2 weeks later, I opened the decision email on a sidewalk and had to sit down because my legs stopped cooperating, and I cried. Ugly, exhausted tears, because years of pressure finally found a crack to escape through. I had won full tuition, living support, and the right to transfer into a partner school network for my final year. When Dr. Harding called, her voice held steady pride, and then she told me one more detail that turned my stomach in the quietest way. The private university my twin attended, Briarcrest, was on the partner list, and if I transferred for my final year, I would graduate there with their highest honors, and the foundation scholar at that campus would deliver the commencement address. I didn't tell my family. I didn't hint. I didn't even let the idea become a conversation, because I wasn't asking for their approval, and I wasn't offering them a chance to reattach themselves to my achievements. I transferred quietly at the start of the fall term, built a small life in a new place, kept my head down, did the work, and for a few weeks it almost felt like I was a ghost in my sister's world, moving through the same halls without being seen. Then one afternoon in the library, she found me. She stood there holding her iced coffee like it had become suddenly weightless, staring like I'd stepped out of a rumor, and she kept asking how, why, since when, and I told her, calmly, that our parents didn't know I was there. Her face shifted through disbelief and embarrassment and something close to fear, and she asked why I hadn't told anyone, and I asked her, just as calmly, if she had ever asked. She didn't answer. That night my phone lit up with calls. My mother, my father, my sister again, and I silenced every single one because whatever they needed to say didn't get to invade my life on their schedule. My father finally called the next morning, his voice tight with authority like he still believed he could summon me, saying we needed to talk, saying it was disrespectful to transfer without telling them, and I said I didn't think they would care. And when he tried to rewrite history, when he claimed he didn't remember saying I wasn't worth the investment, I didn't argue. I let the silence do the work. Because denial is what people reach for when the truth threatens their self-image. He said we'd discuss it at graduation, because they were coming for Sienna's ceremony, and I told him we would see each other there. And I hung up before he could turn it into a negotiation, because the entire point was that they didn't get to negotiate access to me anymore. The weeks leading up to graduation became strangely calm, not because I was numb, but because I had already stepped outside their gravity. I watched them from a distance as they planned the weekend around Sienna the way they always had. Hotel bookings, celebratory dinner, flowers, photos, still convinced they were arriving to witness the payoff of their chosen investment. My sister knew I was on campus, but she didn't know what I'd earned, and she didn't know I'd been selected to speak, and I made sure it stayed that way, not as a punishment, but as a boundary. The truth would arrive without my hand pushing it, the way consequences are supposed to. On graduation morning, the stadium was full. Thousands of people. Bright sun. A field turned into a stage for family pride, and I entered through a side route meant for honors students and speakers, wearing the same black gown as everyone else but with the gold sash that marked the top graduate and the foundation medallion catching light against my chest. From my seat near the front, I could see Sienna further back, taking photos with friends, and I could see my parents in the front row with the best view in the house, dressed perfectly. My mother holding a massive bouquet, my father adjusting his camera lens like he was preparing to capture the moment he'd paid for. They looked happy. They looked confident. They looked like people who believed the world would continue to cooperate with their choices. When the ceremony reached the introduction for the top graduate, my heart didn't race the way it used to when I wanted their approval. It beat steady, controlled, like a door closing softly behind me. The president's voice carried across the stadium, praising resilience and excellence, and I watched my parents angle the camera toward my sister, already assuming the praise belonged to her, and then my name was called. For a suspended second, nothing moved, and then I stood, and the wave of attention turned toward me, thousands of faces shifting, the sound of applause rising as I walked toward the podium with measured steps, and in the front row, my parents' expressions changed in real time. First confusion, then recognition, then a kind of pale shock that drained them of movement. My father's hand froze on the camera. My mother's bouquet slid in her lap. My sister's head snapped toward the stage, her mouth forming my name like she couldn't believe it was real. I reached the microphone, adjusted it once, waited for the applause to taper, and then I spoke in the same calm voice I'd used for years to survive. I told the truth without naming them, without pointing, without begging anyone to hate them for me. I said that 4 years earlier I'd been told I wasn't worth investing in, that I'd been told to expect less, and that I learned to expect more. And I spoke about the work, the early shifts, the borrowed books, the nights when sleep was a luxury and freedom was the only thing that kept me moving. I didn't ask for sympathy and I didn't offer forgiveness. I simply stood there, undeniable, and let the reality settle over them in front of everyone, because the revenge was never me hurting them with words. It was me removing myself so completely from their control that the only way they could finally see me was in a stadium full of witnesses. At a podium they couldn't interrupt, listening to a version of my life they no longer had the power to edit. After the applause ended and I stepped down from the stage, the consequences began moving through the crowd without my involvement, quiet and unstoppable, the way gravity works once something has already been released. I didn't rush toward my parents and I didn't avoid them either. I simply moved where I was supposed to move, shook hands with faculty, accepted congratulations from strangers, and let the room rearrange itself around a truth that could no longer be contained. I watched from a distance as people leaned toward my mother in the front row, their expressions bright with admiration, saying my name like it belonged to her pride, asking how long they'd known, how they'd supported me, how extraordinary it must feel to watch your daughter stand there like that. And I saw my mother smile with effort, her face tight as she nodded through questions she couldn't answer honestly. My father stood a little apart, his confidence gone, his camera hanging useless at his side because there was no photo that could reframe what had just happened into a story where he was the architect. When the reception began, the whispers grew louder. Not cruel, just curious, because people love excellence and they love stories. And suddenly, my story was circulating without their permission. Someone from my father's professional circle clapped him on the back and said he must have pushed me hard, must have believed in me from the start, and my father nodded once out of reflex before going quiet, because agreement would have been a lie, and correction would have required exposure. Sienna hovered near the edge of the room, watching the same realization settle into the faces of people who had always looked at her as the family's future, and now looked past her toward me, not with hostility, just with interest, and that shift unsettled her more than anger ever could. My mother cried, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of restraint that comes from knowing tears won't fix anything. And when she reached for me later, in front of witnesses, I stepped back without sharpness, without explanation, because I wasn't there to reassure her. The questions followed them home in ways they couldn't escape. Relatives calling to congratulate, acquaintances mentioning the speech they'd already seen clips of online, people assuming they'd known all along, assuming involvement, assuming pride that had never been earned. My parents couldn't correct the narrative without admitting what they'd done, and they couldn't accept the narrative without feeling the weight of the lie, so they stayed trapped between the two, watching the world celebrate a version of me they had not supported. No one attacked them. No one shamed them publicly. No one needed to. The absence of their role spoke louder than accusation ever could, and the silence I maintained made it impossible for them to redirect blame or soften the edges. I didn't answer every message. I didn't return every call. I didn't rush to soothe the discomfort they were finally sitting in, because karma didn't need my assistance. It only needed me to stay gone. I didn't stay to watch the fallout closely, and that was the point. Because standing outside the damage means you don't circle it, you don't narrate it, and you don't make it your identity. In the days after graduation, the messages kept coming in waves, my mother sending long, emotional texts that tried to compress years of absence into paragraphs of regret. My father leaving voicemails that sounded unfamiliar even to himself, careful and restrained, like a man suddenly unsure of his authority, and I let most of them sit unanswered, not out of cruelty, but because urgency was no longer mine to carry. When I did respond, it was brief and neutral, stripped of reassurance, because reassurance is a form of labor, and I had already done a lifetime of unpaid emotional work for them. They wanted conversations that could smooth things over, conversations that would let them feel like involved parents again, but involvement after the fact isn't the same thing as care, and I wasn't interested in pretending otherwise. I could feel them struggling with the shift, with the way they were now on the outside of my decisions, my plans, my future, reduced to observers instead of managers, and I didn't rush to correct that imbalance, because it wasn't an imbalance anymore. It was the natural order when someone finally steps out of a role they never consented to. Sienna reached out too, her tone cautious, almost fragile, congratulating me and asking if we could talk sometime. And I listened without anger, because she hadn't created the system even if she benefited from it. But I also didn't offer closeness I didn't feel, because sibling bonds don't repair themselves on intention alone. I went back to packing my things, finalizing paperwork, preparing for the job that was waiting for me, and every practical step forward made the past feel less relevant, like a building you no longer need to walk through once you've moved cities. From a distance, I could sense my parents grappling with questions they'd never had to face before. What it meant to support a child too late, how to explain my success without rewriting history, how to sit with the fact that the daughter they'd overlooked no longer needed them, and none of those questions required my input. I didn't explain myself again. I didn't ask for acknowledgement. I didn't wait for apologies to reach some perfect form. I simply stayed gone, emotionally and practically, and that absence did more than any argument ever could. Standing outside the damage meant I could finally see it clearly. The system had only worked as long as I kept absorbing the cost, and once I stepped away, it collapsed under its own weight, quietly, without me lifting a finger, while I continued forward with a calm I had earned the hard way. My life didn't explode into happiness after that. It settled. And that settling was the real ending, because peace doesn't arrive loudly when you've earned it the hard way. I moved into my own small place, signed my name on documents no one else had co-signed, woke up every morning knowing that whatever happened next belonged to me alone, and the absence of their expectations felt lighter with each passing week. My parents remained somewhere in the background, no longer villains, no longer authorities, just people who had made choices and now lived with the shape of them, and I didn't feel responsible for managing their regret or guiding their redemption. Sometimes my mother wrote letters instead of texts, careful handwriting filled with reflection and apology, and I read them when I was ready, not because I owed her a response, but because I finally had the luxury of choosing when and how to engage. My father spoke less, listened more, and while that change came too late to rewrite the past, it quietly confirmed what I'd already learned. People only grow when the old version of access is gone. I didn't cut them off dramatically, and I didn't rush back into closeness either. I let the distance define itself, because distance, when chosen, is not cruelty, it's clarity. Looking back, the moment on that stage wasn't about proving them wrong, it was about closing a chapter that had already ended the day I stopped trying to be chosen. I don't replay their faces in my mind anymore, and I don't measure my success against their reactions, because the story resolved itself the only way real revenge ever does: quietly, legally, without confrontation, by removing my value from a system that depended on it and walking away without looking back, calm, finished, and completely done.